and painted to look like that. And I know that immediately inside of you, something would flip over. How many of you felt that even just in talking about it? Because you suddenly, you see, experienced it in a different way. If it was secreted by some marvelous sea creature, it's one thing. And if it's made by a human being and carefully and beautifully made, it's a totally different thing. And everything that goes on in your head about it, everything goes on in your heart about it, everything is another matter. It's just another thing. And this happens, you don't have to be trained, you don't have to ever hear anything about it, you just immediately know it. It's something which is directly known to all of us, to all human beings. For one thing, of course, you're astounded. Now, you should be astounded at the mollusk, too, or the little sea creature that made it, because that's astounding, goodness knows. But you're astounded in a different way if you know that it's made by a human being. And that way, of course, is close to you. That is, you are also a human being, and in some way it's something almost a matter of pride to you that it can be like this. But it's a combination of things that make you know immediately that any work of art has its own nature and its own beauty, which no matter how closely it imitates nature itself, is actually separate. I know that all of you have had this experience. I don't need to even tell you about it, because particularly nowadays, because you may go to a public place and see beautiful hanging plants and give them a careful touch, and they're plastic. And you know that the feeling that you have when you do that. Now, you don't characteristically, because they aren't really very complicated, or they aren't really too astounding in their beauty. You think you feel sort of cheated. Is that true? I think most of us feel cheated rather than admiring. But suppose I handed you a silk flower, beautifully made, beautifully scented and beautifully made. Your feeling would be different, because it would be more admiration. It's just because it was well made, because it was beautifully made and well made. And this is part of what beauty has always been, the feeling that something is well made. And for a long time, a lot of different people have described beauty simply as something which was well made, made carefully, made devotedly, devoutly, well made. So that's something that we all feel, even if we don't think that's the whole thing about beauty. That is undoubtedly part of what it is. And part of it is that it's made by a human being. Now, one of the things that seems to us quite easy and natural is to paint landscapes. We come from a tradition, all of us living at this time come from a tradition of landscape painting, and so we're not surprised. In fact, I've had people say to me something like, "Oh, I'm sure it's wonderful for you to live in the country, because then you have all those possibility of landscapes around you, you see." And I'm not a landscape artist, and I enjoy and delight in the beauty of nature, but I don't try to paint it. It isn't the kind of thing that I'm interested in painting. But it is such a natural thing for people to think. Now, actually, landscape is a very special art, and it's one which is, considering the whole production of human beings over a long period of time, it's relatively rare. And it's rare, I think, because it requires two special conditions. One is, the most important one, is that the understanding of the natural world and the attitude toward the natural world has to be one of very deep reverence. It has to be one of the sense of something being mysterious, of something being enormously powerful, of something being, in a way, sacred. That's the first condition. Because you see, we really aren't interested in anything enough to go to the trouble to make a picture of it unless it has some of those qualities, unless it has to us some kind of meaning, some kind of deep, significant meaning, as wide-ranging and as general as is possible. We just don't even see it. If it has no meaning at all to us, we don't even see it. We literally and truly do not see it. And we can't remember it, and we have nothing to do with it if it has no meaning. And if it has meaning, it catches our attention. And if it has very profound meaning, it is something which we are then very attentive to. We pay very deep and close attention to it. And if the natural world doesn't have that kind of quality, if it is, in a sense, just a background to the human being, if it is something which you see as either just useful, so that you think, will this field grow corn, or something which you think as uninteresting, dull, you won't pay any attention to it. So the first requirement for any kind of landscaping to develop is the sense of its sacredness, of its mystery, of its power, of its grandeur. And the other thing which is absolutely necessary is a tradition of depicting things, of making pictures of things. And so those two things don't just necessarily occur, all the time together, far from it. There's only one place, one way, in which they have occurred over a long period of time and have had really an unbroken history of landscape painting, and that's in China. And the reason, I think, is exactly because of what I'm saying. You have landscapes in, at least the 2nd century AD, and probably before that, but probably lost. And you have them right down to the present moment, and in an unbroken tradition of landscape painting. But if you know what landscape is called in Chinese, it's called mountain water pictures. And that's essentially what it is. It is over the 2,000 years, paintings of mountains and water. Why? Painting is in China, and always has been, a matter of revealing the power of the universe, which is in the combination of yang and yin. It's a combination of the dark and the light, a combination of opposites, in other words. So that the painter's purpose is to reveal what is essentially the structure of the universe, and what is also the guiding principle of the universe and the guiding principle of all people, or should be. So that to paint a mountain and to paint the water running down it or running beside it is to evoke the deepest, most serious thought that's possible. Now, you see, that is something which means that there's never any kind of urge to toward any kind of original or particularly eccentric or strange sort of interpretation of this. Your aim is really to make it clear to people that this is the structure of the universe, and to show it by showing mountains and water. The great strength of mountains, the power, the towering quality of them, and the great strength of water, because the mountains are created by the water. The mountains are washed away or channeled or carved by the water running over them. So that what seems to be something very gentle and soft and easily diverted and everything is actually the power that is the opposite power to the power of the mountains. It is the yin power as opposed to the yang power. And so this is something, you see, that's inexhaustible. I mean, it just goes on. It constantly is expressed, and it constantly needs to be. It is a confrontation with nature that aims to reveal the real structure of the universe. Now, let's look at the first two slides, these wonderfully delightful ones, because I think at any time when people confront nature, they feel quite a bit like this man. Oh, here he is, you see over here. There he is, enlarged. And he's such a wonderful, our relation to the natural world is so marvelously like this, you know. Here we are, funny little creatures confronting the ocean and meditating on the ocean. And our relation to it is so marvelously illustrated by this particular figure, and it is, I think, the true relationship. That is, we stand before the mystery of nature, and to what degree we're conscious of it is only the question. And to what degree, confronted by that enormous vastness of the ocean and the hugeness of the sky and the great cliffs behind this man, you see, he's really a tiny creature. To what extent we know that and experience it, he stands to reveal us to ourselves. And it is something which is, of course, and he's an anonymous painter of the 19th century, and it's something which has a lot of the quality of Chinese painting without that particular metaphysical structure. Let's look at the next two slides. Now, one of the things which is important, I think, to think about in connection with the landscape painting in China is that this evocation of a reality is the thing which the artist aims to do, and he aims to do that so intensely that he can almost create the thing. And the stories about the old painters, the great old painters, are always stories of their having created, literally, not as we speak of creation, but created a mountain or created a horse. And one of the great stories is of a man who painted on the wall a galloping horse, and it galloped off of the wall. And another that he painted a dragon and without any eyes. And the people said, "Why didn't you put eyes in it?" "Put eyes in it," the emperor said. And he put eyes in it, and it burned the temple down. The whole myth, you see, is around the myth of the recognition of the real structure of the universe, and the artist's capacity to, in a sense, to tap into that structure. And it's very unlike the great myths around the artists of the Western world, because they're always myths of illusion. And it goes back as far as Greece. The great artist of Greece painted a picture in a contest that a fruit on a plate, and birds came and pecked it. The man who triumphed over him painted a picture, and it had a curtain over it, and the other painter said, "Draw the curtain," but the painting was the curtain. And his having fooled the artist, you see, won him the prize in this contest. It's one thing to fool birds, you see, with painted fruit, but it's another thing to fool the artist with a painted drapery. But it's illusion, and that goes right down to people, to the King of Spain greeting the figures of Velasquez, tipping his hat, thinking it was a person. You see, it's the illusion, the surface, but not the deep structure that the Western artist is characteristically concerned with. And we'll see that. Well, these two paintings are presumably from about the 6th century AD, and they've been copied 1,000,000 times because part of what the artist aims to do is to comprehend what has been done by the great artist to such an extent that there's really no such thing as forging in Chinese painting. If you can paint something which is so much like one of the great masters, you are allowed to sign his name to it. You can then use his name, because the aim, you see, is not any kind of expression of the self. That's something which occurs anyway. It's not something which has to do with a new vision or exploration or anything like that. It has to do with this deep and serious matter of the nature of the world, which is hidden, always hidden. And the artist does more to reveal it, you see, than any language can, or anyone who hasn't given themselves completely and in a sense selflessly to that aim of revelation. Let's look at the next two. Not only is there that desire to continue and to hold on to a tradition, but actually in learning, and it's important to realize that the medium that allows this is pen and ink, which is also dark and light, also yang and yin. It's all brush and ink, I mean. So that the darkness and the lightness create exactly as they can evoke this kind of world, this universe. It's not a world of color. It's a world of the ultimate structure of the universe. And to do this, people carefully learn. You hear people say the vocabulary of painting. Actually, in the West, there's no vocabulary of painting, but in the proper use of the word vocabulary. But in this, there is. Everyone who makes any kind of a picture makes it following very strict principles. Actually, given certain trees, the shape of certain trees, the shape of certain rocks, and the variety of those rocks, all very carefully understood and carefully imitated and carefully revealing, if it's possible for the artist, what is the balance of forces that makes this have that appearance that it has. And so the whole 2,000 years, see, is exactly as in language. The 2,000 years is the use and the harmonious relationships and the revealing relationships established between these perfectly familiar things. This kind of tree, and it's so ubiquitous, and it's never been abandoned. You can get cocktail napkins right now in San Francisco with that same pine tree on it that is in the Tang Dynasty. The exact same one, or not exact same one, only because they've lost the seriousness and the power, but not because they aren't using the same images as closely as they can. So it is. Well, I think we can understand it in two ways. If you think of a play, if you think of Hamlet, a great production of Hamlet does not change the words. And it's only great if the interpretation of this perfectly familiar set of words is superior to someone else's interpretation. That's all it is. That's the only thing that makes it. And everybody knows that. You don't go, to Hamlet to see how it turns out. Or if you do, it's another matter. But you go instead to see how it is interpreted. And of course, exactly the same thing is true of music. The difference between being able to play all of the notes, and of course, if you say I can play such and such a piece, it means you can play all the notes, whether you turn out to or not. That's the aim and everyone's expectation. You're not supposed to go trailing off in the middle with something that you invented. And if you do it well enough, that's very nice. If you get all the notes and you give them a certain proper thing, and if there's a certain amount of expression in it, interpretation in it, but that doesn't make you schnabel. That doesn't make you a great interpreter of Beethoven, for instance. It's not at all, not for a moment. And you don't think so, and nobody else thinks so. It's perfectly agreed on that this is not it. Now, what is that? You see, he's using the same notes in the same order, with the same weight on them. Everything, you see, is the same, but the difference is enormous. But it has to be known. You have to have that degree of connoisseurship to know that. And that's the way Chinese landscape painting exists and is. It's an interpretive art. And it interprets the structure of the world, the divine structure of the world, the great energies, male and female energies that make anything possible. So let's look at the next two. Here's a, I know, absolutely deadly familiar tree, isn't it? I mean, you've seen this tree a 1,000 times, and you've seen those mountains, you've seen those other trees. All of it is familiar to you, because it is a constant. It is something which is always there. Now let's look at the next two. Another thing which makes gives an extraordinary quality to some Chinese painting is the system of having a scroll or roll that you hold in your hands, and you unroll it and roll it up with the other hand, and consequently you have something introduced into it, into looking at a work of art that commonly we don't have, which is an element of time, so that it's even more evidently a performing, an interpreting thing than it would be otherwise. Because you are instructed, really, you can't help it. You can't see what's coming until it comes. So it acts to lead you on, and it makes possible in a single painting, a long painting, which is not unrolled to be looked at, but is slowly unrolled. It makes something which is like music. That is, you can start with something very quiet and move into a great elaboration. This is a hand scroll over here on the left. You can't quite see that other end of it, but you see how it builds to a crescendo, literally a crescendo of mountains. And then those echo and reverberate and exchange reverberations with each other back exactly like the development of a theme. And then gradually it goes into silence. Now, here you have a detail from the middle. So you can see, you get a better way of seeing the distant mountains. You can see them better. Let's look at the next one over there. There's another view. You can find your way around here. You can see by the outline of that's still in the center, but a closer view. Now, all of this done, of course, with a brush, all of it done on silk, and all of it aiming to reveal exactly that quality of a crescendo strength and the quietness of the water and the stream, which is over there, comes through here. Let's look at the next one over here. I have several details. See, there's the next row of mountains. You can see it gets lighter, and you can see the shape of them with that little single one pointing in the middle. Let's look at the next one. It's just nice to see these this way, because this is in a sense the way you would see it if you unrolled it. And so you see, then you come to that part, and the whole character of it changes, doesn't it? It becomes much more amiable, much more pleasant and attractive, rather than rather awe-inspiring or even terrifying by the size of the others. And let's look at the next one. There's even on this side what we can't see clear at the end of. And let's look at the next. You see how the same shape of mountains actually change, and they change all the time. And there, the water finally quietly moving, so that what was almost an explosion of power and authority becomes something which is dreamy or poetic at the end. Let's look at the next one. Here's the very last one. See, the whole quality of it, the whole experience that you have when you look at it, is quite different from the experience you have when you look at the middle part. So that actually you are led through different experiences of landscape. Let's look at the next one. Over here. Now, landscape is not natural, not inevitable or natural. And it's the best way you can think of it, of course, is that there apparently was never any Greek landscape. There was never, the Greeks, though their paintings, all of the paintings which are lost, there's no reference to landscape. And the paintings which are left to us from Rome are also, when they are landscape, they are another kind of landscape, a gentle or a controlled landscape. The whole of the Mediterranean concentrates on mankind. And it may be because people have lived there for so long, or maybe because they've worked the land for so long, that it has a kind of docility that makes it possible to think of human beings as more important than the natural world. And certainly that's what is thought, and it continues to be thought in Rome. And here you have two Roman paintings, one called a pastoral scene, because the natural world, the world of the country in Greece, of course, was scorned utterly. To be any kind of a person, you had to be an urban person. You had to be civilized. Otherwise, you were a barbarian. And the Romans and the late Greeks and the Romans both began to think in terms of a kind of pastoral idyll, something in which people would play and cavort in a beautiful, very carefully tended world with a few sheep and a few shepherdesses and so on. Not the dangerous natural world, and not actually really, it's almost possible, I think, to say a sentimental view of it. This concentration on a single tree, or concentration on this little garden. Let's look at the next two. Very beautiful paintings, very, very beautiful, completely decorative paintings. This is the house of Livia, and the garden and the orchard and everything in it, you see, has the quality that makes a garden, makes really a paradise or a garden, but not anything which has to do with that kind of serious comprehension, metaphysical comprehension that you have in the Orient. Let's look at the next two. The Western world doesn't have that. And it is 1,200 years between the last paintings that you saw in these. 1,200 years in which there are no landscapes. From about the 3rd century, 2nd century, to the beginning of the 16th century. There's no actual landscape. And the first landscapes that appear are in Germany, and you can understand that, because I think it takes a recognition of wilderness, a recognition of the untamed aspect of nature, a wild place where there are undomesticated animals, wild and dangerous animals, the sense of something which is not only is not dominated by men, but never will be, never can be, is itself too powerful. And that quality did exist throughout the whole of the Middle Ages in the northern part of Europe, and not, of course, in the south. And if you think of Germany, which was mostly forests, tremendous forests, and swamps, and fog, and cold, and darkness, and all of the world actually full of demons that were invisible but demonic. In the Middle Ages, it was considered extremely dangerous to look too long at the world. Your eyes are supposed to be up or down, but not looking out. And it isn't until the beginning of the Renaissance because the world, I suppose you could say that in the Black Death, people felt that God had abandoned them and left the world. And that left it to them. And so they began to explore it, and they began to take it apart and try to understand it. And part of that makes it possible then for a landscape to occur. There's nobody in this, there's no people in it. It's not about some kind of a story. It just is a landscape. As by a man named Albrecht Altdorfer, whose great fame is that he was able to do this. That he was, because this is an enormous invention, you see. It isn't, he didn't have examples. It was an invention of the idea that nature itself, and this really only faint indications of man's presence. They are, of course, people, but I mean not the habitation of people, but the actual natural world is the thing which is interesting. Let's look at the next two. And one of the great ideas of the 16th century, an idea which is again current among a number of scientists, was that the earth is an animal. The world, the actual world we live on, is an organism. And that organism we are a part of, but we act on it almost like parasites. It has its own life, and we sort of scratch around on the surface or dig into it a little, and that's all there is to it. The world goes on with perfect indifference to us. And Bruegel is one of the great painters of that idea, and undoubtedly all of his work gives this quality, so that you have the introduction of a serious idea about the nature of nature, and one which has great ramifications and great significances and very profound meaning, so that people become something just like their dogs. And he loves this view of nature in which they're just tiny little people. And this is a detail from that painting, as you can see. And let's look at another one over here. Again, these busy little creatures scratching around on the top of the world, and the world going great distances, the sky above it, absolutely indifferent to all of this action. Let's look at the next one. Over here. There's another. This is a painting that's in the Metropolitan in New York, one of the great treasures that we have in this country, because it is again, these are not terribly large. They're really house size, or not museum size. And there again you have the world, enormous, stretching great distances. And people, unless they're actually working at something, are really very unattractive. They are slopping around and lying around and stuffing their mouths and taking a rest. Are perfectly legitimate. I mean, they've been working hard, but it's not what you could think of as a very noble or elevated view of man, and it's far from it, because Bruegel, let's look at the next one. I think I have another detail of that. Yeah, it's over here. See, that's just a detail of that other painting. It just goes on endlessly, and always with this sense of the majesty, really the beauty of the world, and the vulgarity and absurdity of man. And when it's something, let's look at the next one over there. Oh, that's another detail. It makes a whole great picture. You've seen it's only about that big. I mean, an inch by 2 inches, what you're seeing there. Next one over there. There's another, the little church that you see in the distance. The next one. And when he uses some mythology, this is Icarus. You remember Icarus was Daedalus' son, and Daedalus made himself wings and made some for his son out of wax, and they flew. And the sun flew so high that the sun melted the S-O-N, flew so high that the S-U-N melted his wings. And he fell into the sea. And it's a great parable of man overreaching himself, of in a sense challenging the gods. And how does Bruegel see it? Well, you'd have a hard time finding Icarus in this picture. All that you can see is his foot, where he falls in the water. Where he falls in, his foot is still above the waves. And that's all that's left of him. That's the whole thing. And the rest, of course, is this marvelous landscape, this beautiful sea, and the person plowing, still plowing, perfectly indifferent to this thing. Absolutely uninterested in it, and it itself not interesting anybody. It's just the plow goes on no matter who dies, as one of the proverbs that's associated with it. Let's look at the next two. And now, this is a Christian subject matter. This is the crucifixion. And again, you'd have a lot of trouble finding Christ. And you would have he's in the exact middle of the picture, the exact. If you made a cross in both directions, it would be in the exact middle. He's carrying the cross. But what has Bruegel done? He's made out of this a wonderful entertainment, which of course executions were up until the present time. And everybody's come to see this wonderful show that's going on. And over on the right, you have a detail you see from the very back of the thing, over here on the right. See, all the cripples are beating their way to try to get to the place where the cross is. And the place where the cross is where that circle up there at the top, the circle is of all the people who came early and wanted to get a good seat, you see. And so they're all, it's just a dense circle of people and the three crosses. And then Christ is carrying the cross here and looks toward us with an expression of despair. But the meaning of it is the meaning of the splendor and the grandeur of the world, and no human action, no action of any kind, even makes a dent in it. It doesn't make a dent in the people, the other people, and it doesn't make a dent in the world. Let's look at the next two. Now, also, another thing which has caused a lot of landscape painting to have a kind of seriousness is the sense of the beauty of one's own place, one's own world, one's own country. And I think that occurs in the 17th century because everybody traveled everywhere. And the great explorers had brought news of all kinds of exoticism. And the place that was home began, because of that, to have an own special kind of sweetness, a special kind of charm. And since this occurs so conspicuously in Holland, you see, everything about the 17th century in Holland has to do with the great change that comes about where you have what is actually a society that is not dominated by royalty and is is a mercantile and to a great extent a secular world. That is a world very much like our own. And the response of the artist was to paint everything, everything. And over on the right, as you can see in both of these, Holland is very flat and not very promising, therefore, as a subject for landscape. But this is embraced. And one of the landscapes of the time is called flat landscape. And you could apply the name to a whole lot of them. I mean, you wouldn't have to have just the one that the artist himself called that. But there is that love of this flat world. That, let's look at the next two slides. That makes such an extraordinary burst of landscape painting. That people just there are more than you can imagine. More people painting landscapes, and painting everything else that was near and dear, everything, whether it was children and animals and still life and whatever it was that was right there, becomes something which is precious and something which is endlessly depicted. People had huge collections. It's really so much like our own time. If you just think of what happens in our day, you have almost an image of what it is. People had great collections. They had collections in their own houses. There were no museums. And they had a room in their house that was simply stuffed with wonderful things, beautiful materials from China and all kinds of paintings from everywhere, and drawings and etchings and furniture and tiles and oriental rugs just stacked in, you see, into a room in their house. It was a time of this accumulation and this delight in the ordinary world, but such a love toward it. It's such a passion about it, such a love about it. Let's look at the next two. There are a whole number of these. This is of an old cemetery and synagogue, and there the sea rough. It makes for marvelous. A flat landscape makes for marvelous clouds. Let's look at the next two. The biggest change, and the thing which most affected Western landscape, was at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, the development of Romanticism. And in it, you have extraordinary approximation of Oriental and Western images. Why do you have it? Because one of the things which happens is that people begin to think of nature, of the natural world, as containing all power. And power to create, of course, Darwinian idea, that nature creates all of the variety, all of the wonder, all of the things which people have always been astounded by. Nature has created those. And she holds, and it is always a female image, she holds all the secrets of the world. And all that you have to do is uncover them. Now, this was the attitude both of the artist, you see, and of the scientist, and of the person who was a naturalist, who was an amateur naturalist, was that nature was this great treasure house, enormously powerful to create and destroy. Man's function was to meditate on nature, to admire it, exactly as in China. And the subject matter here, this is called kindred spirits over here on the left. And the one over on the right is kindred spirits watching cloud formations. See, the nature is power. Nature is the reality. And man's function is to meditate on it, or, of course, to explore it, or to examine it scientifically. But it is the whole reality of the world. And I can show you endless. Let's go on and look at some more of these, because it's just exactly the same subject matter that you have. There are some people watching the moon, and here's some other people watching the moon. And they're watching it for exactly the same reason. that they stand in awe of nature. Nature is a power, and it is a terrifying and infinitely beautiful but awesome power. And their function is to admire and to meditate on these qualities. Let's look at the next two. And again, he's like our little man, and of course painted at almost the same time. Though in very different places, because that's a German of Friedrich's. But he's doing, here's his Chinese counterpart, you see, sitting in the wilderness, and it is wilderness. It's not in a city, you see, it's not in a town, it's not, it always has man in it, exactly as this has. It has the presence of man and the importance of man, which is that he can, in this sense, actually worship nature. See, it is an act of worship, which he contemplates the power and the beauty, the majesty and the mystery, really the sacredness of the natural world. Let's look at the next two. There's, again, now, almost exactly the same, and not as an influence, because that's Turner over on the right, and here a Chinese painting of a very early time. But it takes the same attitude, you see. It still sees nature as something mysterious and infinitely to be studied, infinitely to be worshipped. And the great difference is the difference that in Turner the world begins to turn into color. And it begins to dissolve in color. Let's look at the next two. He's waving at the sea. It's all that there is to wave at. And there he stands waving at it. And that one over on the right is contemplating it. But how wonderfully the artist has made him, because it's impossible to take the same kind of humility, to actually learn the same kind of humility about the nature of man. For Western people, it's impossible. And he has, though he's contemplating peaks of mountains and fog, we don't have any difficulty finding him in this picture at all. And he is the hero. The world is not. The natural world is not the hero. And essentially, even though he's much smaller, he's making a great gesture toward the natural world. And it is a romantic, an excessive gesture, but delighted at it. Let's look at the next slide. Greetings to the world. Again, the world is seen as something which is just in its least effect, in its smallest and least effect. Grace of a tree, the vastness of the ocean. Let's look at the next one. That sense of emptiness and desire for finding emptiness. And very often the feeling of a sacred mountain. And of course in Japan it is a sacred mountain. But the great act of the romantic artist was to make nature seem sacred. To make it seem, and of course out of that comes, so much of what we do and think and art. Out of it came all of the development of our natural parks, all of the whole romantic literature about nature. It all springs from this same urge, the same sense that nature is a mysterious and awesome power. Let's look at the next two. And of course that was particularly true in America. Over here on the left you have a French painting called the Sublime, the immensity of the sublime. And over on the right you have Niagara Falls. And America stood for everyone as one of the greatest evidences of the power of nature and the mystery and the wonder of nature and the marvelous variety of nature. And such great things as the falls, or let's look at the next two slides, Yosemite, or any of the powers you see here, Yosemite, and over on the right, the pleasure in revealing, exactly as the Chinese wanted to reveal it, the power of nature and the destructive power, the power that is frightening. And he makes this terrifying storm in the mountains, which is, of course, is powerful and is frightening and should be. But now people see it with joy, because it is as if they heard Joe rattling his thunderbolts, you see. It's just an affirmation of the divine nature and the humanly uncontrollable nature. Let's look at the next two. There's more of the natural world of America, but this is a much gentler image. Over on the right, you have a detail of this painting over here on the left. It's a very small, 2 feet by 3 feet painting. And let's look at the next one over on the right. There's another detail of it. You see, each one makes a marvelous painting. And they're very small, exquisite detail, beautiful sense of the lyrical joy of nature, unlike the terrible storms. Let's look at the next one over on the right and on the left. And one of the things which makes the painting of landscape still, and I suppose will be for a long time, strongly attractive to people, is the quality of poetry. And that poetry in 19th century and early 20th century painting is a poetry of light. It's a poetry of moonlight, of sunlight, of the dissolving quality of light, so that what is actually firm is dissolved as it is there and as it is here, so that all that we experience is the poetry of light. Let's look at the next two. I could show you 100 of them that are all exactly the same thing. Seeing in the natural world not that terror, not the power, not even the charming sense of home, but a deep poetry, an expectation of some mystery that is tantalizing and never to be resolved, but always stands before us. And it takes the form of light. Let's look at the next one. See, these are by different painters, and even maybe 50, 60, 70 years apart. But the feeling is the feeling of nature and poetry. Let's look at the next two. They're very beautiful. And this, of course, that love of landscape, that delight in it, the fact that the tradition exists, makes possible perfectly untrained people making landscapes, which is exactly what happens right to this present moment. They do it because there is a tradition. And they do it because the tradition includes a way of doing it, that is, an actual means of depicting it, as well as an idea that landscape is interesting and valuable. And both of these are by anonymous painters in the 19th century. And see, why did they do it? Why did they do that? Why did they sit down and paint these pictures? They were not pictures which were intended just to be sold. They were not pictures that were intended for any galleries. There weren't any galleries or museums. It was not to make themselves famous. It was a thing which artists do and which other people rejoice in their doing. It is the delight that people feel when it is possible for them, exactly as when it's possible for them to see beauty. Then they can delight in beauty, and they can be supported in that delight if other people. But if you can see landscape, and there's a support for that, and everybody can see it, and everybody can enjoy it, and what they can do is set it down, and just look at it and set it down as well as they can. And let's look at the next two. Grandma Moses. With her love of the country that she lived in as a young person, she makes a picture of it. And in that, she makes it last. She makes it real. And this is what the artist always does, or wants to do, tries to do. is to make something not like nature, real like nature, but not unchanging, and holding and stopping the moment that is a beautiful moment. All people have that urge. I wish I had a photograph of it. I wish I could paint. And it's because they want to capture and hold something which is passing, something which is elusive, something which they value and know that they will never see again. So that whether the person is trained or untrained, it is toward that preservation of the moment, that preservation of the precious thing, that all art aims at. And nature herself is absolutely indifferent to. Thank you very much. I love it. Thank you. That's a nice picture. It's nice to see that people who love something and want to do it, isn't it? It affirms all of us, doesn't it? It makes all of us stronger than we were. And I think it's marvelous that Grandma Moses did that. And a lot of people sort of make fun of it, but they have no right to. They have absolutely no right to. These are perfectly charming, delightful paintings. And that she did them, we're all lucky that she did them. Don't you love them? Don't you think they're charming? They're such a kind of playful and delightful thing to see. Thank you very much, anyway.